Fairbanks Focus is a locally produced public affairs program created in part by University of Alaska Fairbanks, KTVF, and Fairbanks Economic Development Corporation.
Good morning. Thanks for joining us here at Fairbanks Focus Alaska View. I'm Annette Pearson, and today I'm being joined by Bill Oberle. He's joining us over the phone. Bill Oberle is the director of the Alaska Innocence Project. Thanks for joining us this morning, Bill.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Well, we're really excited to be talking to you today. I know there's been a lot of news surrounding your organization, but first I wanted to start off by just talking about what the Alaska Innocence Project does, who you are, and kind of go from there.
Okay, I'd be happy to. We are a nonprofit organization that incorporated in the state of Alaska, and our mission is to identify and exonerate wrongfully convicted Alaskans. In simple terms, that means that we try and identify people who have been wrongfully convicted for whatever reason and remain in prison. We review their cases, and if we're convinced that a person has been wrongfully convicted and we can prove that in a court of law, then we will take on their case and try and free that wrongfully convicted person.
Well, and how did the Innocence Project really come about? How did you guys get started here in Alaska?
Well, you have to go back to the early 90s when the Innocence Project, the first of them in the country, was started in New York City by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld. They realized they both were criminal defense attorneys and had become familiar with DNA technology through their criminal defense work, and they realized that this technology could be used to identify people who have been wrongfully convicted, that if evidence showed that the person who left the DNA was not the person that was convicted, then they could identify and free these people. They began the Innocence Project in the early 90s thinking that they could handle all of the claims of wrongful conviction in the country, because they do take cases nationwide. It didn't take them long to realize that the number of wrongfully convicted people in the country was enormous. So they encouraged regional innocence projects to start, and one started at the University of Washington called the Innocence Project Northwest, and they were handling all of the claims of individuals in the northwestern United States.
Well, that's a pretty big area.
But it didn't take them long to realize that that was way too many cases for one organization to handle. So in 2005, I think they said we can only handle cases in the state of Washington, and so Alaska was left without any Innocence Project working on cases, and so the organization started in Alaska in 2006.
Wow, so it's got actually a pretty long history. And so would you say that it's sort of the history is sort of directly tied to the use of DNA and the technologies that advanced in justice?
Well, DNA certainly was what started the recognition that wrongful convictions do in fact exist, and that we do now have the technology to correct them. As science has progressed, cases that arise now, DNA evidence is less likely to be involved in exonerations of cases where the person is convicted more recently, but there are a number of other forensic sciences that are in question now and are being worked on to correct fingerprints, firearms technology, tool marks, arson. All those forensic sciences are being reviewed again to determine if they can be brought up to the kind of quality that DNA has.
Well, that's pretty advanced and interesting stuff. And I know you guys have been working with a number of different cases. One of the bigger known cases, of course, here in Fairbanks is the Fairbanks 4 case, Now, I'm not from Alaska originally myself, and at the time of the murder of John Hartman, I think that was 97. Is that correct?
That's correct. October of 1997.
Yes, and at the time I lived in Tucson, Arizona, but I would have been about 17 years old at the time. And so to hear about it, not being from here, it's a really fascinating and interesting case. Could you talk a little bit more about the case?
Sure. I can give you a little background on it. On October 11th, 1997, John Hartman was assaulted at the corner of 9th and Barnett in Fairbanks. He was found there as some people drove by in the early morning hours of October 11th. They called the police. Police came and got him, took him to the hospital. Within hours of locating him, the police had already arrested two people who eventually were charged and convicted of the crime, George Fries and Eugene Vent. Both these young people were taken to police headquarters and questioned without parents, and both of them made statements that were characterized eventually as confessions, although that characterization has been questioned all along, and the boys have since made it clear that they had nothing to do with that crime. Eventually, 4 people were charged, those two, and Marvin Roberts and Kevin Pease, and they were tried 3 different trials held here in Anchorage because of the publicity up in Fairbanks, and they were convicted of the assault and eventual death of John Hartman. The case has been, all 4 of the defendants appealed, and their convictions were upheld, but the case has been kept alive because the boys have continuously claimed that they are innocent, and there have been questions raised about the convictions since they happened. And I say boys, they're in their 30s now, but they were very young men when they went to prison.
Well, and I think that's one of the reasons why this case resonates with so many people too. It's a really interesting case. I mean, the boys were about 17 at the time, and they all were charged with very lengthy sentences. I think the shortest one is like 33 years.
That's correct.
So yeah, to think that you're only halfway. It was about 15 years ago. You're only halfway through. Less than halfway through a 33-year sentence. So it's definitely, I think, one of those things where it definitely really should be looked at. And so lots of more information has come to light and been developing in this story, and you've been very instrumental in presenting that information and getting it into the right hands. Can you talk a little bit more about some of the new stuff that's been happening? I was reading in the paper about some confessions that you've gotten from actually other individuals.
That's correct. The Alaska Innocence Project started looking at this case in 2008. And the reason we started looking at it is because we had received contacts from a number of people from different spheres of life in Alaska, both from the interior Native community, from the legal community, and other individuals, that this was a case that people were concerned about and troubled by, and that it's something we should look into. And as we began looking into it, the Alaska Innocence Project also became concerned about it and troubled by what happened. And the deeper our investigation, the more troubled we became. Our investigation led us throughout the United States. We interviewed many people, and eventually part of our investigation revealed names of individuals that people indicated had information about what really happened out there. Now, that's not the only time our investigation came upon names that people said actually committed the crimes, but this time it panned out. We made contact with, or tried to make contact with a number of the individuals named, and eventually were able to make contact with William Holmes in California, agreed to talk to us, and we interviewed him. And eventually I went down and did an in-person interview down in California, and he came forward with what actually happened on the corner of 9th and Barnett that early morning hours of October 11th. That statement by Holmes started our process in looking deeper into other parts of the case, and we eventually felt we had enough information to file a pleading post-conviction relief action for the four men. The centerpiece of the evidence is the statement of William Holmes, which describes what actually happened. But we also provided the court with newly discovered evidence consisting of new scientific evidence that support claims that the eyewitness identification was flawed, and that an evidentiary item, what was claimed to be a boot mark on the face of John Hartman, was a flawed evidence as well. So we've put a fair amount of information before the court on newly discovered evidence supporting William Holmes' claim that he and the others were the ones that actually committed the crime.
Well, and so what's the next step for the Innocence Project now?
The next step is the state has 45 days to respond under the court rules, and they've indicated that they will look into it in that time period, and that they may be asking for more time to review the information.
Well, you know, it's a really fascinating case, and I'm really hoping that we get to hear more about what the state's doing to investigate and look more into it. And I really appreciate you coming on the show today. And I would like, Bill, if you can, just let our viewers know, if they have any questions, how they can get a hold of the Innocence Project, including how they can get a hold of you if they have other concerns and are looking at helping get people who are wrongfully sitting in jail out. Is there a way of contacting you, Bill?
Yes, there is. We have a website. It's www.alaskainnocence.org. We also have a Facebook page. If you are an individual who's wrongfully convicted and want to contact us, we ask that you write us a letter. Our address, I can give it to you. It's P.O. Box 201656, Anchorage 99520-1656. That address, of course, is also on our website. And if you write us, we will make contact with you and see if we are able to review your case. If you just want more information, both our Facebook page and our website are a place to go for that.
Well, thank you very much for coming on the show today, Bill. We really appreciate it, and we really appreciate all the work you're doing here in Alaska.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure, and anytime you want to invite me back, I'm happy to come.
Well, thanks. Well, and I'm sure we might be seeing you some more as this case continues to develop. Next up, we have Annie Bartholomew, and she'll be talking with some more people about the Fairbanks 4.
Welcome back to Fairbanks Focus, Alaska View. I'm Annie Bartholomew, your host, here with Heather Taggart and Sharice Walker, two UAF journalism graduates and former editors of the UAF Sun-Star, the student newspaper. Thanks for coming on the show, you guys.
Yeah, thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, you are welcome.
So can you tell me where you first heard the story of the Fairbanks 4?
Well, back when we were in school, they weren't yet known as the Fairbanks 4. And I know that, I grew up in town, and so of course I was a teenager when they were convicted. And then Brian, starting journalism school, Brian O'Donohue, who had been a reporter at the paper, he was an editor at the News Miner at the time that the whole case went down. He, having stepped in as a journalism professor, brought the case to his investigative class as an ongoing investigation.
Right. I also grew up here, graduated from Lathrop, but was out of state when the actual murder took place. So moved back at the end of 1999. and really wasn't aware of the extensive circumstances until taking Brian O'Donoghue's investigative reporting class, fall 2002.
What was that investigative reporting class like, and what methods did you use to uncover the story?
Well, it was a very hands-on kind of class. Brian felt that we benefited more from actually working on something in real life versus just learning out of textbooks. So he had this project that he felt strongly about, that he didn't have time to work on when he was at the News Minor, and kind of picked it back up once he became faculty. And so it was very insightful as to journalism in real life and what journalists actually do outside of the classroom.
Yeah, I'd say it was a real reality check, because here was something that was very serious, and Brian always presented it that way, that this is something that didn't get the attention and the manpower at the paper that it deserved for journalists to fully do their job in bringing truth to the people, because there were certain aspects of the case that the public didn't know, and it deserved more time. And at a daily newspaper, you don't always have the time. Reporters have demands that they have to have 2 or 3 stories out in a day. They don't have the time for the follow-through, for the calls that they need to make. People can blow you off on purpose and not get back to you, and you have a newspaper deadline and the paper's going out, and the people who have answers that you want, they refuse to get back to you. Whereas if you had some more time, you would be able to develop a relationship with this potential source and give the story the time that it needs to come to light.
Right. So every semester there were different aspects of the case to focus on, because this has been going for years. And so in the semester that I was in his class, another student, Tom DeLon, and I took up interviewing the jurors of the Roberts and Pease case to try to figure out what was the most compelling part of this case. If you look through the documents, there's so very little physical evidence that it's hard to imagine how 4 men were convicted in 3 different trials on that. And so we were very curious, what was it as a juror, that was so compelling that you would come back with a guilty verdict. And so we interviewed the various jurors and came across a demonstration that they held without the judge's knowledge that did sway, at least some of them, their opinions about some particular testimony.
And I remember we were in the Sunstar office when you were on the phone calling people, right? Is that right?
I did some from home and some from
Yeah,
the
so
office.
I didn't actually take the investigative class, but I was in the other journalism classes at this time, and we all worked together at the Sunstar. And I distinctly remember being at the computer working on stuff when you got off a phone and said, boy, that just doesn't seem right. And Tom was in the office too, and so you guys began talking about it, and I kind of didn't realize what all was going on. And I remember that, was it you that brought the phone book back from Anchorage? Or was it someone else?
I don't think so.
I was almost an observer. I mean, I was an observer for part of this, being involved with the whole class, all of us that were in journalism at that time. But I had my own duties at the Sunstar, and I remember being, and of course my memory could play some tricks on me, but I do remember that we were all in the office, and you had said that somebody brought a phone book back. So it was kind of interesting day to day. You have an entire semester, and Brian has 2 semesters a year to get as much help on this ongoing investigation as possible. And he asked somebody who was going to Anchorage, pick up a phone book while you're there.
It might have been Gary Moore, because
Okay.
he was also in the class with us.
Okay. And so someone brought a phone book back, and then the next step is look up all the jurors, and then it's like, who's going to call them? So these students, it was really exciting, because we, and I say we as in I was just observing, but I was part of the class. They were part of the graduating class,
right.
Part of the group. They were doing the work. They were doing the legwork that could never happen on the daily beat at the newspaper. And so it was exciting to learn from that, even though I was just going alongside it.
Were students eager to learn and to make these phone calls, or was there some resistance to taking on a big, intimidating story like this?
Well, I think that there was a little bit of intimidation. I mean, to pick up a phone and call somebody and say, hey, you remember that murder trial that you were a juror on, 3 years ago? Some people didn't want to talk about it, and I can understand. I mean, it was a horrific, terrible thing to happen in our community, and to have to be part of that, I'm sure, was a heavy burden. And so some people didn't really want to talk about it. Others, were willing to talk about it. And but yeah, it was a little intimidating to pick up that phone. And it was kind of the process where you learn that, as a journalist, you have to kind of put that mantle on, that you need to be able to walk in and ask hard questions, and that you have that privilege and the right to do that maybe just average people, wouldn't, but, if you're representing a publication and you're representing the readers and basically the community, I always felt like I, as a journalist, was doing a community service. It might just be a borough assembly meeting, but there were thousands of people who couldn't be there for that time, and it was my job to go and find out what was important and share that. And so it definitely helped me to develop that sense of, it's not necessarily a cape, but you have a special presence, and you have a responsibility, and that gives you a little more courage to do those things that are a little uncomfortable.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the photography you did during this time?
Yeah, I was I was involved in two different things. I was involved in two different demonstrations for the photography. And one was the families and friends of the convicted men demonstrated downtown. They made signs, and they marched from, I'm not certain where they started in town, but they marched to the courthouse. And it was a very cold time of year, and I came down with the camera and was able to photograph them along their walk, and then as they gathered in, I believe it was Golden Heart Park, actually, and it was either that or the courthouse, and I haven't looked at the photos again recently, but that was a privilege to be a part of that. But anytime a demonstration happens, it's kind of crazy because it might only be 20 people, or it might only be 100 people, and yet they were calling attention to the fact that they maintain their innocence. They maintain, the boys and their families maintain their innocence, and that they didn't want their incarceration to be forgotten. They were fighting. So here's their family and friends out on the front line, keeping hope alive, reminding everybody, hey, this is still an issue. We still maintain our innocence, and we want a retrial, and we don't forget about us, don't forget about these men. And so during that time, you can imagine it was somewhat emotional because people were fighting essentially for their family back, for their lives, for their freedom. And I just saw a lot of that. And for me as a photographer, it's very easy once you're on the scene to go into work mode, to start photographing the event, to do the best job possible, running in the snow, or fingers freezing, shooting that. And I was freelancing at the time, so I called the News Miner and asked them if they'd be interested in the photo, and they were. And so I sent that in. And one thing that I observed that was really special, but also calls into question journalistically, how do you behave? I witnessed, give me a moment. I'm probably going to have to say this multiple times because I'd rather not be upset when I say it on TV. I'll say it first casually. What I witnessed was the families, I don't know who this person was. I was kind of overtaken by the moment, but one of the women said to Brian O'Donoghue, "What size are your feet? Like, what size shoe do you wear?" And at first I thought, what's that about? And then I realized that this family wanted to bless him with a pair of, slippers. They wanted to do something for him. Because He was working so hard for them. And if these men are really innocent and they've been in jail this whole time, and he's one of the first people to push really hard when the police have completely betrayed you in their minds. That's why I have to be careful what I say, but in their minds, everybody else had falsely accused them, falsely imprisoned them, stolen their lives. This is not a joke that we were a part of this. These are 4 men's lives, plus the man, John Harmon, who was murdered, plus whoever else got off, and whoever knows about that. If it's all true that these men are innocent, then there are some serious implications here in the community. Why would they be, why would somebody push so hard to convict innocent men? And is it because of prejudice of the community? Is it because someone had ulterior motives? Is it what are the reasons? And that's why being a part of this investigation has been really confusing, it has really pushed the limits of our thinking as journalists, having to leave no stone unturned. What are everybody's motivations? What are the other potential parts of the mystery that we don't know, So the neat thing about being a journalist is you do have that opportunity to be strong, ask hard questions. You have a privilege that other people don't have. You step into that role and you have almost a cape, or however you want to put that. However, you're still human, and your compassion drives you to ask hard questions, to think there might be more out there. Like, I don't turn my emotions off when I go to work, and I've been able to carve a niche for myself as a journalist where I do maybe more family portraits for people, other softer news, because I don't have the strength. I have strengths of my own, but I don't have the strength to pretend like it's not bothering me. That's something I really don't have. I have a lot of strength where I can ask hard questions, but one thing that's been coming up a lot lately is the question of bias, and whether when you're close to a case or part of a case for a long time, do you then become biased because you believe now that these men are innocent, even though outside in the court of law they say they're not innocent? I don't really know that makes you biased, because if that's the truth, and all you've done is uncover facts to try to find the truth, then I don't think it's fair to say that person is biased because they have an opinion. I think someone who's biased has ulterior motives, maybe, has something to gain from one outcome or the other. And that's what we have to be careful of. But we have to be careful of our law enforcement, of any agencies who have something to gain. And so we scrutinize that all the time. That's part of our job. But I think that all of the community, all the people in the community in our different professions, we need to keep each other in check. And that's why I'm proud to be trained as a journalist. I'm proud to be trained as a UAF journalist, to have been a part of this program, where we worked on a very, very real case that affects the community and, as far as I'm concerned, the nation. And it will be awesome to see the outcome, and to continue to watch and observe. We'll see what happens.
Right. Well, thank you both for coming on the show. I'm your host, Annie Bartholomew, and to check out more of our program, you can at fairbanksfocus.com. Thank you.